welcome to the second edition of the CNBC Sustainable Future Forum. I'm Joanna Bersecci with Juliana Tattlebaum, and today we'll be exploring whether governments and corporates are delivering on their green goals as we build up to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh next week. We'll look at how the events of 2022 have fundamentally altered the race to net zero under three overarching themes: responsibility and regulation, future power, and industry response.
There is a renewed urgency as the world grapples with the energy crisis sparked by the war in Ukraine. Here are some key voices from our coverage this year.
We are in the middle of the first truly global energy crisis. Our world has never ever witnessed an energy crisis with this depth and complexity.
So you've got the convergence of the war and the need to address climate change. And that war has really been an accelerant, not just in the United States, but across the world.
The idea that we still need oil and natural gas is also, fairly clear. We're not going to drain all the money away from those sectors. That's how people get to work today. It's how people avoid freezing to death in the winter.
Russia keeps actively manipulating our energy market. I mean, they prefer to flare the gas instead of sending it to Europe according to the contracts that are existing. So this market is not functioning anymore.
If I asked anybody in Europe 2 or 3 years ago what they wanted from energy, they would almost exclusively have said net zero. If I asked them today what they want from energy, they will inevitably tell you they want an energy system that works.
I think there'll be more announced and more engagement than people anticipate from Sharm el-Sheikh. I think that I have confidence it will make progress. So our hope is that COP27 is going to raise ambition, and I think it will.
Public and private sector leaders often struggle to move beyond broad targets and commit to real change. COP26 in Glasgow ended with an 11th hour dilution of the global pledge to phase down coal, with the summit president Alok Sharma emotionally expressing his deep disappointment at the result, while telling delegates, quote, "The pulse of the commitment to 1.5 is weak." Now, Steve sat down with former Obama Special Assistant and current Counsel on Foreign Relations Senior Energy Fellow Alice Hill and asked if she is worried about the pace of change in the last year.
Very concerned. We are not acting swiftly enough, and the impacts and the danger are overtaking our efforts.
And when you say we, the problem is we aren't working in concert, are we? All the hope of the last two big conferences was that the great emitters of the world, the great powers of the world, can come together and work cohesively. Do you think geopolitics is getting in the way?
Well, I think geopolitics actually has always gotten in the way. This is a global challenge. We know that nations that need to act, the G20 cause 80% of the emissions. That's the 20 most powerful economies across the world. But we haven't seen that kind of decisive move to remove the accumulation or stop the accumulation of harmful greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere. So the globe continues to heat up, and it affects everyone, all of us who live on a planet, and all of our natural systems as well.
Yeah, I mean, the problem I always find on the crisis and the prevalence of it is it always slips down the pecking order. There's always something else, whether it's the clear and present danger of COVID, whether there is a war in Europe and the ramifications of that, and what we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine as well. It always seems to go down the pecking order. That's a real concern for those of us who think it is the clear and present danger.
Absolutely. Climate change has suffered from the problem that I learned in the White House. When I worked in the White House, quickly it became apparent that the urgent would overtake the important. Of course, climate change is now urgent, but the war in Ukraine, tensions between the United States and China, other geopolitical strains tend to overshadow the need to work on and continue to drive progress towards addressing climate change. And that's really been the state of play since scientists first raised these alarms decades ago at this point in the last century.
Yeah, Alice, it's very interesting you should reference your work in the Obama administration as well, because the fear for many people looking in at the United States, which is arguably the most important player globally in this whole process, is that we're at the whim of the electoral cycle. Would you dispute that, or would you say, yeah, that's a real worry?
It's a real worry. We are facing a midterm election that could have significant consequences. Of course, the United States, under President Biden, just passed the most important climate legislation in the nation's history, the Inflation Reduction Act, which puts about $370 billion towards clean energy. But if our Congress should change with Republicans taking over the Senate or the House, and we also see state governors, mayors, if those should change and it becomes more heavily Republican, that will change the direction of the United States in terms of its commitments to cut its greenhouse gas emissions significantly by 2030. And that is unfortunate because we've seen with President Trump flipping the switch on President Obama's policies. And now with this midterm election, it will make it more difficult for President Biden to continue to drive forward. And then, of course, in 2 years, we would have a presidential election, which also could change our path. So it is a major concern.
And yet, whenever I've made that point to senior US politicians, and I've spoken to one or two senators about this, they say, look, there are bipartisan efforts going on. And I think you yourself point out to the Climate Adaptation Resilience Strategy, which has bipartisan support. This potentially offers a part of the way forward, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And as the United States suffers far more disasters, and these disasters are mounting in costs. There are a variety of reasons for that, but part of it is because the events, flooding, drought, wildfires are worsened by climate change. There is a growing understanding on a bipartisan basis that the United States needs to address these risks. The challenge is that there is not agreement about speaking and planning for future risk. We don't have widespread agreement, at least expressed by the Republican Party, as to the cause of climate change. And then we don't have widespread discussion of the fact that human-caused emissions will cause the climate to continuously change and rapidly change. So that's not part of the discussion. So we are still struggling for how to find the common ground to properly prepare for and cut our emissions to keep the heating from getting unmanageable.
But do you feel also perhaps one criticism of the Biden administration, and I appreciate you're coming at it from a Democratic point of view, is that you're not offering a cohesive policy to the energy companies? I spoke to Secretary Granholm in Glasgow at COP26, and my colleagues have spoken a lot to the oil industry of the United States since, and there is a concern that the energy companies are speaking one language and the administration is speaking another language. Do you think there's something missing in the agreement to move forward between the two and actually work towards a common purpose for keeping prices lower at the pumps and keeping America competitively in a good position from an energy point of view and having the transition at the same time? There appears to be something missing to me in the language.
Well, certainly people can be talking at cross purposes, but there is a stated vision coming out of COP 26, 27, pick your COP, that we need to cut our carbon emissions. Of course, the United States is a huge producer of fossil fuel energy as well as fossil fuel products. So the transition from that is uncomfortable. It's going to cause some areas to be more constrained and others to grow. And those growing pains and those constricting pains are what's on display. So it's a question of how quickly we do this and the choices we make. But the International Energy Agency has said we have to get off fossil fuels. So that is the debate here in the United States, and we can't come to agreement.
As the airline industry emerges from crisis mode, will more focus be placed on the industry's net zero by 2050 target? For more, let's bring in Willie Walsh, IATA Director General. It's wonderful to speak with you today. Thank you for joining Jumana and myself. The aviation industry has certainly been at the heart of so many conversations around climate change, aviation making up 2.4% of global CO2 emissions. I'd love to kick off with your overall thoughts and expectations as we head toward COP27 coming up in just a short while.
Well, from an aviation point of view, I think we're in a good position. The industry is absolutely committed to achieving its target of net zero by 2050, and that's been bolstered by the ICAO Assembly meeting in September, October of this year, where ICAO and governments have now agreed what they call a long-term aspirational goal to achieve net zero by 2050. So both politics, if you like, governments and the industry are aligned on net zero by 2050. We clearly need to turn that aspiration into harder targets and into a plan of action. But from an industry point of view, we're absolutely committed to addressing this issue. And we see this as the most important issue that we face over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
How difficult is it for the airline industry to decarbonize compared to other industries?
Yeah, it's very difficult. As you quite rightly point out, we account for about 2.4% of man-made CO2 today. We recognize, however, as other industries decarbonize, and for many of them, there are relatively simple pathways to decarbonization, our contribution will increase, because we will continue to be dependent on kerosene to power our aircraft. Now, technology will provide some solutions, but quite honestly, we're not prepared to depend on something being developed in the future. We recognize we have to do something now. So for us, the key to our goal is the use of sustainable aviation fuels. The science there is proven. What we've got to do is turn what is very low levels of production of sustainable fuels into widespread availability. And this is a real opportunity, not just for the industry, but it is a real opportunity for countries around the world to start producing a sustainable jet fuel, which will help not just to address the environmental issues, but will also create jobs.
We talk about the role governments play in helping to encourage this transition. And I just wonder, from your policy standpoint, what do you think is more effective, the carrot or the stick approach? The carrot in the sense that the government can go down the path of providing subsidies and tax breaks to companies to encourage investment into cleaner, greener energy, or the stick approach, which is where a situation where companies get taxed or consumers get taxed for emitting higher levels of carbon. Which one of those do you think is more effective?
It's a great question, and quite honestly, all of the evidence that we have available shows that the carrot is far more effective than the stick. And I think there, as I said, there is a lot of evidence. You know, we can look to issues in the UK, which has the highest environmental tax, initially introduced as an environmental tax. I think the government, after years of being embarrassed by the fact that not a single penny of the taxes being raised were used for environmental purposes, have tried to move away from that. But what we see is that taxation is a very blunt instrument. In many cases, actually, it would make our industry less efficient. I don't think it would stop the number of planes flying. It would definitely reduce the number of people flying on the planes. And that would be a silly thing to do. What we need to do is to ensure that our planes are more full rather than less full, and to provide incentives to produce sustainable aviation fuels, which will make a genuine impact on the environmental footprint of aviation.
Very valid point. What is your opinion of carbon offsets? I see so many airlines these days offer consumers the option of buying a carbon offset, which is essentially for many of them just means tree planting. How effective are these policies in reality? And are they just a means for airlines to present green credentials without actually being green?
Well, I think offsets in general probably have a bad reputation. I think as the airline industry has focused on offsets, we've been very clear that we need to be able to demonstrate that any money that we invest in offsetting does deliver a genuine reduction in CO2. Now, for the airline industry, this is going to be a positive because under the ICAO framework, which is a government framework, international government framework, they have agreed an offsetting scheme, a global offsetting scheme called CORSIA. But the offsets in that scheme will be validated, will be audited. So this will be, if you like, the true gold standard, a clear understanding that the offsetting being undertaken will help to reduce CO2. I think there have been offsetting schemes in the past. I've seen many of them myself, which lack credibility and quite rightly should be criticized. So we have to ensure if we are using offsets that there is a credible evidence that those offsets are achieving the objective of reducing CO2.
Willie, let's talk more about sustainable aviation fuel. You talk about it as being a key feature of how the aviation industry becomes more green. The problem with sustainable aviation fuel is the cost. I understand that it currently costs 2 to 4 times more than conventional jet fuel. How do you go about bringing that cost down?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing I would say is, despite the cost, in 2021, the industry used every single drop of sustainable aviation fuel available. So, despite being in the depth of the worst crisis the industry has ever seen, we continue to spend money on sustainable aviation fuel. Now, in a strange way, the recent volatility in the oil price and particularly the volatility in jet fuel prices, which has pushed up the price of jet fuel significantly, has made that differential smaller. It has actually, if you like, provided added incentive to airlines to pursue this. We've also recognized that sustainable aviation fuel, because it can be produced through multiple pathways and doesn't rely on the traditional fuel producers, will be a less volatile product going forward. So, the industry is absolutely committed. I have no doubt that every single drop of sustainable aviation fuel produced in 2022 will be used by the industry, and that is despite a price differential of about 2.5 times. And the same will apply in 2023. So what we want to see is greater production. Obviously, greater production will bring down the unit cost. The reason the cost is so high today is that sustainable fuels are being produced in low volumes, and clearly the overhead is being spread over a low volume of fuel. Once we get greater commitment to production, we expect that price to reduce. I think there will always be a premium to conventional, traditional jet kerosene, but that's a premium that the industry is willing to pay.
Well, it's been a very volatile couple of years for the airlines industry. The pandemic saw travel completely dry up, and then we had a summer of so-called revenge travel where airlines were simply not able to meet the capacity that demand was warranting. For many airlines, the theme the past couple of years has been one of survival, not one of thinking about longer-term sustainability and a transition to, again, greener, cleaner operations. Where do you think we stand now on this sustainability topic, given the turmoil and the financial turmoil so many airlines have been under?
I can assure you it's top of our agenda at the annual general meeting of IATA in 2021, in October 2021, so still in the midst of that crisis. The industry committed to net zero by 2050, recognizing that there was going to be a significant cost to transition from where we are. So we see this as existential. Let's call it what it is. It's a challenge that we must address if we're to have a future. We talk all the time about financial sustainability and financial viability, but in the same way we talk about environmental sustainability as well. So the two go hand in hand. And I can assure you, I talk to airline CEOs all the time, and their actions speak louder than their words because, despite this crisis, they've continued to commit significant capital to address this issue. So at a time when capital was scarce for the industry, you saw the greatest investment in new technology, in sustainable aviation fuel, investing in other technological developments like carbon capture. So the industry is absolutely committed to this, and we recognize that it's something that we have to do. Our consumers, our customers want us to do it. They are in many cases demanding that we demonstrate that we're capable of doing it. And the feedback that we've received recently from the surveys that we've been doing has been very positive. I think the fact that we are committed to net zero in 2050 is important, but demonstrating that we have a credible pathway to that net zero is equally important. And people are beginning to recognize that through sustainable aviation fuels and other initiatives that we can achieve that clear goal.
Well, an encouraging end to our segment then. Willie Walsh, thank you very much for joining us today, Director General of IATA. Now, helping both developed and emerging economies push towards common sustainability goals while also tackling other economic, political and health crises is a make or break factor in the race for net zero. Tanya joins us with more. Tanya.
Thank you so much, Jumana. Yes, I've been speaking to the model, activist and UN Goodwill Ambassador for the International Fund for Agricultural Development, Sabrina Dory-Elba, who told me about the devastating effects of climate change on rural communities. I started by asking Sabrina, who's attending the upcoming COP27 in Egypt, about what she wants from the latest global climate conference.
You know what? I'm tired of just hoping, because we've already seen pledges made, not just at the last COP where we saw countries pledge to double their investments that they made promises on to help developing countries in Copenhagen. So I'm ready to see action, Tanya. I'm really frustrated about just hearing the plans. I need to see funding brought over to people in rural areas who are dealing with the devastating effects of climate change. And this is really, really, really important for the food security of everyone. I hope that everyone understands the role that is so crucial that rural people play when it comes to food security. And I believe they're the face of climate change because they are suffering most. So I hope to see plans, and I hope to see action out of those plans.
Of course, you attended COP26. What was your own experience like there? And have you seen any kind of progress?
We did see, I would say there was progress made in the conversation, because it was nice to see Africa sort of put on the map and be at the forefront now of conversations. And people started to talk about the importance of adaptation and mitigation being, having equal funding, or at least even more funding to adaptation, because at the moment it's just mitigation that's on the table. So I think there was progress in conversation. I think this COP now being in Africa, being in Egypt, of course, it's going to be really, really crucial for leaders to step up and make true on those promises.
How hard is the climate crisis hitting rural communities? What is the scale of the problem?
The hardest, the absolute hardest. I do say they're, the faces of climate change because they are the custodians of this planet. They understand the biodiversity of the region. They provide food for 2 out of every 3 mouths on this planet. I mean, food security is absolutely important for all of us. But when you see things like food prices spike and you see the cost of fertilizer spike, it's people in rural areas and developing countries that are hit the most, obviously, because they depend so much on export, because import is only going to do as well as we provide funding for. These people need climate resilient seeds, they need technology. So the situation is dire. I mean, I'm Somali. I don't know if you know, I'm of Somali descent. And every time I visit back home, I mean, it's drought and conflict and drought and conflict. It's just devastating, the effects. And it's easy to ignore when you're in the global north because we don't see it as much.
What would you like governments to do more than they have been? And of course, we've seen reports from the UN itself saying that we're far from meeting crucial climate targets by 2030.
I would just love to see rural people included as part of the conversation. At the moment, they only receive 1.7% of climate funding. They are absolutely part of the solution. There's an interesting science, Tanya, that if we switch to green energy, if we did everything right today, we would still not meet our goals that we set in Paris, because nature-based solutions have to be part of the answer. We need to regrow our forests. We need to look at the agricultural sector. So it's such an important part of the conversation that so often gets left out. So I just would love to see it really, really brought to the table in a meaningful way.
You were appointed Goodwill Ambassador for the International Fund for Agricultural Development in 2020. Tell me about the mission of the fund and why it's such an important role for you to take on.
Well, if someone told me I'd be a UN Goodwill Ambassador for an agricultural fund, I probably wouldn't have believed them because it doesn't sound like the sexiest conversation, does it? But I understand so much now the importance of what IFAD do because, you know, there's a place and time for aid and, you know, there's devastating things that happen all over the world, but investment and helping people wean off the aid model in terms of working for themselves and building entrepreneurial ventures and showing young people they can return to rural areas and benefit off rural land is so important. You know, you can always give someone a fish, but giving them a fishing rod and teaching them how to fish is so important. So I'm so proud to be able to support IFAD. You know, I actually started with them on a trip in Sierra Leone that had, we visited a region that had just gone through the Ebola pandemic, not knowing that we were about to see, you know, a global pandemic and seeing at that time what IFAD did for the people in those rural areas who were suffering through the pandemic, helping them through it, helping them, you know, come back together and recover. It just woke me up to the importance of programs like this and organizations like IFAD. So I'm so proud to be a UN Goodwill Ambassador for them. And I'm sorry I sound so passionate, but you know, you work on the ground and you speak to people and you see how dire and important these situations are.
You've talked about your own frustration about the lack of action. Do you think these COPs are still relevant?
I think so, because I think conversation, although, you know, sometimes I'm frustrated that it is just conversation, is so important because otherwise it starts to be forgotten, doesn't it? We lose sight of progress and being able to track what progress has been done so far. It's a constant reminder, I think, COP, that these issues are there and that government leaders need to step up. I don't think it's lost its relevance. I just hope that it is going to move forward in a way that means more action than planning.
Can we achieve, do you think, the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, especially towards ending hunger and poverty?
I hope so. I really hope so. And it would just require people stepping. I don't understand what everyone's waiting for. You know, Tanya, I really don't, because like I said, the programs are there, the facilities are there. It's just about stepping up and redirecting funding in a meaningful way.
I've also been speaking to the head of the UN Development Programme, Akim Steiner, who's calling for the West to recommit to helping the Global South in funding renewables. I asked Akim if he feels there's been any progress in climate action and the global energy transition in the last 12 months since COP26 in Glasgow.
Well, first of all, I would argue that the world has been on a progressive path of acting really on the 2015 Paris Agreement, and Glasgow was a milestone, and we saw also in Glasgow at the Conference of the Parties many countries coming back with their national climate strategies, their so-called nationally determined contributions, signaling not only progress but also increased ambition. So building off Glasgow and seeing that we have made progress, and here let me just remind you, in Paris we were on a pathway of 3.5 degrees global warming. By the time of Glasgow, because of all the actions that are being taken, incremental, more ambitious, we are now on a trajectory of 2.8 degrees. Now, this is no reason to either feel more secure or comfortable, but it shows that progress is possible. So yes, and there are countries that are advancing very rapidly. There are others that are not advancing. This is part of our challenge, on top of which we obviously now face the current disruption, uncertainty in terms of global geopolitics, global energy prices, and energy insecurity.
What has been the biggest disappointment for you, though? What promise hasn't been kept?
I think the biggest disappointment is probably that we are not investing enough in one another. There is a great deal that can be done, and countries have proven that they can advance. There are countries in Europe today with 50 to even 70% in the case of Denmark of their electricity now being generated by clean, renewable energy resources, close to 50% in Germany, wind power in the UK. But many developing countries have also invested heavily. Uruguay today, 94% of its power coming from clean energy resources. A country like Kenya in Africa, also over 90%. But what has not happened is that what we agreed in Paris and also in past conferences, that the wealthier part of the world would also co-invest significantly in developing countries being able to accelerate these energy transitions. We are still arriving at the next conference in Egypt next week, with that $100 billion pledge not fulfilled. This is a great letdown for many, because it is only by co-investing that we will be able to make these advances.
But Akim, despite these meetings, and as you're saying, the upcoming COP27, what needs to be done in terms of action? Because only last week you had the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying that the world is heading for catastrophe unless urgent action is taken.
And I think these two concepts, catastrophe on the one hand and the polar opposite, urgent action, I think summarize the dilemma that every government, every society faces. We need to pivot into a clean energy matrix. We need to take our power sector, our transport sector, our industry sectors, and literally move them rapidly towards a clean energy matrix. That's the only way to bring carbon emissions down.
So the message is the same. So why aren't people listening?
Well, I would argue people are listening. Look at the tens of millions, hundreds of millions of young people who are turning away from their elders, from their leaders, from their political systems in frustration, increasingly in desperation, because they can see that what is happening right now is essentially putting them into a situation where they will no longer have a choice. Imagine by the year 2030 or so, we will have passed the point of no return in terms of a 1.5 degree world. That means anybody who will be 20, 30 or 40 years old in the next decade or two essentially has lost even that opportunity to choose to go a different path. This is, first of all, why citizens across the world, north and south, are protesting, are going onto the streets. I think what we do need is the leaders in our political systems, but also in our economy, the CEOs in the financial system, in industrial systems, to take responsibility, to put their money where science is telling us we not only have to be, but there are opportunities. And every year that passes is a lost opportunity. But let me also say, things are happening. For instance, the International Energy Agency predicts that we will probably peak in terms of carbon emissions somewhere around 2025. That is, just a few years ago, something that would have been unthinkable. Also, last year, 81% of all new electricity generating infrastructure in the world was renewable. The energy revolution is already underway. The question is, do we remove the obstacles to allow it to go quickly to the level we need it to be?
Akim, you were talking there about the younger generation. And of course, the climate activist Greta Thunberg came out only recently and said she would not be attending COP27, and reportedly saying that these meetings are mainly used as an opportunity for leaders and people in power to get attention using many different kinds of greenwashing. Are you disappointed in her for saying that?
I think Greta Thunberg and the millions of other young women and boys or girls that have taken that kind of initiative, I think deserve our admiration. Our role as people who have either the means or the power or the opportunity to do something about it is to act on it now. I can fully understand that people will look at these climate conferences as often missed opportunities or even a waste of time. That argument I would counter with a very simple proposition. Bringing the whole world together under the floodlights, so to speak, of global public attention once a year has been at the heart also of allowing us to reach a Paris Agreement. The fact that so many heads of state and government will again come to the conference in Egypt, I think is more an expression of the public pressure that they feel, including the UK Prime Minister, who I gather has now changed his decision not to attend, because the public expects them to be there and to commit.
What do you think COP27 can achieve that hasn't been achieved before to ensure a sustainable future?
I think at this particular moment in time, let us be very honest, to keep the world together, despite all its differences and tensions around the Paris Agreement and the common goal of addressing climate change, would already be something that would serve us all very well. There are hundreds of reasons to disagree, to haggle, to negotiate, and there will be very difficult issues, from financing to the issue of loss and damage to the balance between adaptation and mitigation. These are some of the key issues that will, feature at this particular conference of the parties. In part, they are there to negotiate in order to arrive at something that is ultimately a result that everybody can live with. But most important, I think, will be that we come out of Sharm el-Sheikh, out of the conference in Egypt, with a sense that whatever is dividing us right now on this issue, we are by destiny and by commitment aligned in how we need to act, whether this is China-US dynamics, whether it is also the link between energy security and the opportunity to exploit energy resources in the global south. There are many different facets to this reality, but there can only be one outcome to Sharm el-Sheikh, and that is the Paris Agreement is holding, the world is aligned to work together, and we are going to advance despite the disruptions and setbacks of the moment. I think that would be already, to many, a very reassuring outcome, in addition to some of the negotiated results that will be worked on by the parties during these 14 days.
There is a renewed sense of urgency as the world grapples with its transition to cleaner energy. The war in Ukraine and consequent energy crisis has pushed governments and businesses to seek alternatives to fossil fuels. Is this an opportunity to accelerate investment into clean energy, or will compromises be struck in order to guarantee stable supplies? Very happy to bring in our panel now. We're joined by Arjan Major, the president and CEO of Embraer Commercial Aviation, Paul Kildemo, CFO at Hydro, and Marta Martinez Quimedalos from CEO of Zero Generation. Thank you all for joining us. Very important discussion taking place. Marta, I would like to start off with you because you are the CEO of a solar power company. And I just wonder how the energy crisis that we're witnessing across Europe at the moment, whether or not that has accelerated investments into renewables, and of course, solar being a key part of that.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. And the answer for this is that clearly this energy crisis is accelerating the investment on clean energy. And we have two main aspects on this. One of them is governments trying to protect consumers from the impacts of the energy crisis, trying to reduce the reliance on gas imports, and at the same time trying to increase the energy security and the energy independency. On the other hand, we have corporations that are being more and more aware on how much they are exposed to fluctuations in energy prices. So they are looking for stable and fixed prices when it comes to energy prices and energy agreements through PPAs with green generators. So the output here is quite evident. The energy crisis is pushing to everyone to invest in renewables because they are the ones that are under local and domestic control, and they can bring this independency that all of us are looking for.
Paul, let me bring you into the conversation. You at Hydro have not only your own net zero goals, but you are also developing net zero products. And let me put a variation of Jumana's question to you. How has the energy crisis changed how you navigate those goals?
Well, they've at least not reduced them. And what is very comforting for ourselves to observe is that even though we are in a high inflationary environment, we still see strong demand for low carbon products. We're able to sell these at the premium, despite that we know that the industries are challenged at the end of the day. So I think even if the world is looking a bit more difficult, the trend is still there. What we're struggling with, and a bit back to the previous speaker, is that things are not happening fast enough. We need more renewable energy, and we need it much quicker. There's still this NIMBY mentality, and if we are to be even close to deliver on the ambitions we have, we at least need to triple the amounts of investments into renewable energy, and then we need to be ensured that regulators allow that to happen fast. So our strategy remains, but we need more help from the outside to deliver on it.
Let's turn to Arjan now. A question for you about the actual investment and construction decisions that go into the aircrafts that you're putting together. I just wonder how challenging it is to come up with a net zero aircraft in this environment, because earlier on we were speaking to Willie Walsh, the Director General of IATA, and he talked about the fact that the industry is moving towards using more of this sustainable aviation fuel, but one of the limiting factors is that there simply isn't enough of it to go around. So how do you incorporate your resource challenges with the goals that you set for yourself?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you for having Embraer on the show here. Embraer is the third OEM of aircraft in the world, but the number one in the smaller segment. And we believe Embraer can make a difference there. We have newer aircraft currently available that burn up to 25% fuel less than their predecessors. So that's kind of the first step where we're making the change. The next level is what Mr. Walsh talked about, is the focus on sustainable aviation fuel. So our aircraft are certified to fly on a blend of up to 50% sustainable aviation fuel. And we hope to, before the end of this decade, to boost that up to 100% for the existing products, but also, for example, for a new aircraft, the turboprop that we're bringing to market, we hope to bring that into service with 100% sustainable aviation fuel. And then beyond that, we have a family with concept called Energia, which is really a family of aircraft in the lower segments where we believe we can bring alternative forms of power to the market to get to a net zero 2050.
Arjun, we were talking about the regulatory and policy environment with Willie Walsh earlier in this program and the importance of the regulatory environment in terms of fueling this transition. Over in Brazil, where your company is headquartered, you've got a new leader, President-elect Lula, coming into power, and there is a lot of hope, it seems, that Brazil's prospects when it comes to climate change and combating it have improved and will improve under his leadership. What's your take? Is Brazil on a different path now?
Well, we'll have to see how that pans out. It's a very recent change, as you are fully aware. What I can say is that, firstly, Embraer has very strict internal targets to also on Scope 1 and Scope 2 within ESG to improve on the sustainable footprint. And to Mr. Walsh's point, we're helping closely with the Brazilian industry also to develop SAF. So we recently started a cooperation with Raizen, which is a huge energy company in Brazil, on that pathway as well. So Embraer does try to work together with local industries also to improve the SAF production over the years, even though, of course, our first and foremost objective is to develop aircraft that can deliver to the 2050 goal.
Marta, let me come back to you. Europe is right now scrambling to adjust its energy mix in order to reduce its dependence on Russia and also to become greener in the future. What role will solar and can solar play? What percentage do you see solar being of the European energy mix on a medium to long-term basis?
I think solar has a fundamental basis to be the winner technology in the energy mix in Europe in the short term. So this is an easy technology to deploy. And the only challenge that we need to face when it comes to increase the renewable penetration in the energy mix is how we can give the grid the stability that the grid needs. And this is only through investing on energy storage technologies, whether hydrogen or batteries. And Zero Generation is really investing massively on increasing our presence in that segment and bringing to the table projects with batteries standalone in UK, in Greece, and in other markets that we are working on. For sure, the deployment of the solar technology has been the winner and the bigger percentage in Europe and I think worldwide. And in Europe will play a relevant role because there are a lot of industrial players with a huge knowledge that are deploying all of the projects across Europe. The only thing that could be missing is the governments giving us further support when it comes to regulation and it comes to simplify the way to face the permitting process that is been more and more complicated in the last years. And finally, this crisis in Europe has bring us a huge amount of volatility in different aspects, like supply chains, as some of us are mentioned, PPA prices, interest rates, and supply chains difficulties. So we need to address these problems to get solar installations to be the biggest player in the short term.
Marta, just a couple of follow-up questions for you. The first is, in the past we've talked about the prohibitive costs of solar deployment, and I know that these costs have come down a lot over the last few years, but are they cheap enough at this point to allow for widespread take-up of solar as a significant use of energy, significant source of energy, I should say? Second question is with regards to what you're saying about investment in the grid. Where does the European Recovery Fund come into that angle? And are you encouraged by what the EU leaders agreed upon at the height of the pandemic with regards to putting more funds into the green transition?
Yeah, I think starting for the second one, I think this is one of the missing parts. So governments need to help the transmissions and distributors, operators to invest on the grid solutions, and the private investors to invest more with facilities and support on these storage new technologies that now are not in the money, but they are going to be if the governments allowed us to have a regulation that the investment is attracted. And when it comes to the reduction on the price of solar, I think the biggest proof that this is completely economical viable is that not only ground mountain installations are spreading across Europe, not only in the more solar countries like Spain or Italy, but also private consumers are increasing their private installations to be more independent, because the payback of these installations is now affordable for everyone. So not only bigger players and bigger industrial companies, but also private consumers that want to be more independent and get their invoices cheaper.
Paul, I want to bring you into the conversation. Aluminium is notorious for being quite an energy-intensive industry. How have you had to reevaluate the way you think about energy consumption in light of the energy crisis that we're witnessing right now?
Well, it's correct that aluminium is an energy-intensive product, but that's in the production phase. And when you look at how you make changes in the period to come, you have to look at the whole user phase. So when you use aluminium in an automotive or in aircraft or in other products, it results in less emissions than alternatives. The good thing with aluminium is also that it's infinitely recyclable, so that when you've used it, you only need 5% of the energy originally consumed to bring it back again. So from a full value chain perspective, aluminium is not that energy intensive. But of course, the current environment, high energy prices, risk of rationing some places, these discussions come to the table. So we have, in line with the falling demand in the market, also had to adjust our capacity accordingly. And this time around, compared to earlier times, we've actually adjusted capacity at the primary smelters and kept volume up at the recyclers, which are much less energy intensive. So you do things differently when the markets are tighter, as we see now.
Paul, thank you for weighing in. Arjun, I want to come back to you. We have got the COP27 summit coming up, and this conversation is hopefully setting the scene for what we can expect, what we might hope to see from leaders at that summit. From your perspective, how useful are these gatherings, and do you have high expectations for what we could see come out of Egypt?
I believe these gatherings are hugely important. I see more and more aviation people attend as well. I think as Mr. Walsh laid out, aviation is responsible for 2.4% of the global CO2 emissions. But it's one of the industries that has really embraced the goal to get to a net zero 2050. The challenge of the industry is that it's a difficult application of energy on 30,000 feet height, minus 60 degrees Celsius. Weight and volume play a huge role. So our industry needs to make fundamental changes to go to hydrogen-based aircraft, as we just talked about, for example. So it is very important that on a global level, we make sure we sustain a level playing field across the globe between airlines to make sure they can invest in these new technologies. And that we also get rulemaking that is solid for many years to come, because we're talking about big investments, big changing technologies, and unfortunately long lead times. So it's going to take many years to bring that to market. And for the parties to do that, we need a stable outlook on where we're heading as an industry. And I think that's where COP27 is really important.
Absolutely. Well, we want to thank all three of you for joining us today on our panel. That is Arjun Major, the President and CEO of Embraer Commercial Aviation, Paul Kildemo, CFO of Hydro, and Marta Martinez Quimedalas, the CEO of Zero Generation. Thank you.
As companies across the world promote their green credentials, it is imperative they're held accountable for the targets and promises they have set. Are their goals achievable? And what are the consequences if targets are not met? And how much have they adapted their net zero ambitions in light of higher energy prices? The UN Sustainable Development Goals are a set of benchmarks designed to promote global peace and prosperity. But with the high-level targets comes the complexity of taking specific action to meet them. Steve sat down with the CEO and co-founder of SDG Monitor, a cloud-based measurement tool that integrates actions with the SDGs, and asked for her hopes for COP27.
The most important thing in the COP27 that is now starting in a few days is that we have to start to implement. We have to start to implement that what have been discussed, and we have to start to also to look more forward. And in the business perspective, we have to put the current CEO and the management accountable of their sustainability goals that they have set, and start to break down those long-term goals into small-term actions, into short-term actions, and that way to build up our way to the long-term goals through the short-term actions that are more concrete and realistic to do and achieve.
Yeah, that's very interesting because, as you say, people look at the long-term challenge and say, I can't do that, or it's too concerning for us to do it. But if you break it up into smaller pieces, that is very important. What about pushing them with the stick as well, though, with a bit of regulation? I know you're a fan of more regulation, but a lot of governments at the moment are saying we don't need more rules and regulations. What specific kind of regulation do we need to galvanize opinion and to get companies and industries moving?
Absolutely, the regulation is needed. That is what I think. And because we don't know how the companies are doing currently in their sustainability agendas. Are they on track? Are they leaving behind? Maybe they're ahead towards their targets. It is something that we don't know because without regulation, everybody is doing their own thing. And it's quite a wild, wild west out there. And it creates a lot of cherry picking, maybe greenwashing as well, because they are not necessarily showing the performance and their data in a similar format that is recognizable. And most importantly, why regulation is needed, that we need these common shared practices, and we need data that is collected and calculated in a similar way from one year to the next. And thus also we start to build these databases where we will be able to see some trends. And all of this is possible for the businesses to do. And of course, yes, it is a must to start to measure the sustainability performance.
And I hear what you're saying about the measurable forms across industries, across companies, and data is part of the solution there as well. But implicit in what you're saying is that we need this now and going forward. Does that mean up till now we've just basically seen greenwashing from companies that have exhibited all kinds of SDG and ESG credentials, but not really followed through?
I would not say that we have been doing only greenwashing until now, but the focus has been a lot in the reporting and just ticking the box that we have done now. Our sustainability report is an annual thing and it has to be done. While we should take more the approach to showing the impact of our actions. What is the positive impact that we are creating through our sustainability actions? Let's take this saving energy. There are concrete ways to save energy, and the impact is we are going to do some cost savings, and also we are going to reduce our carbon footprint.
Juliana, are we finding it harder to move on with this because of the war? Just as simple as that. Whilst there is a war going on in Europe, the largest war we've seen in the last 80 years, will we ever see progress on these issues while there is a clear and present danger and, of course, concerns about saber rattling from the Russians and about expanding this as well? Can the movement get back on track while we have this other clear and present danger?
I do believe that sustainability is something that we should regard as a trade-off. And something that every time something happens, we should be putting sustainability on hold. Of course, this situation is very pressing towards the companies and their ability to continue achieving their sustainability goals. And that requires a lot of adaptability and resiliency from their part, but also bold leadership skills. And in order for us to keep and continuously going towards the sustainability agenda. And the green transition is something that we have to continue doing, even though there are things happening. This will not be the last crisis that we are facing.
For our next panel, we are joined by Thomas Scholz, the CEO of German construction firm Bilfinger, and Paul Keel, the CEO of British engineering company Smiths Group. Wonderful to have the two of you with us today. Thomas, let me kick off with you. What has it been like as a corporate over the last year trying to make good on your green commitments against the backdrop of an energy crisis, high energy prices, and major energy security concerns?
At first, let's take with all the crises what we have and the energy crisis too, especially here in Europe, the positive approach. Everyone is now aware of that we have to work more on sustainability. It actually makes it companies like us easier to send that message towards the clients and especially towards our own colleagues, that in the core of our doing, we have to have a positive sustainability impact. On the negative side, of course, a lot happens. It's a very volatile business environment we are acting in. That, of course, consumes a lot of, let me say, nerves.
Definitely a nervy time, and it is a big focus of the markets right now, especially when you look at the state of the German economy. A lot of focus on how industry has been responding to this energy crisis. If you look, say, fast forward a couple of years ahead, do you think that the German manufacturing industry will be in a better position, a more energy secure position than it was a year ago?
Yeah, you have to divide between two perspectives, a midterm 3 to 5 years and a longer term 5 to whatever time. Personally, I think that the next 3 to 5 years will be very difficult for the German industry because we have a high ambition here, political ambition to change into sustainable energy supply, and especially as a more on the lonely side for Germany without nuclear power, where I'm actually a big supporter of. And that makes it, the industry and the society, quite difficult to see that the energy prices will be low. Then in roughly 5 years, we strongly believe that we have more sustainable energy, sustainable available, not only in the amount and sustainable delivery, and then the industry will have lower prices and a better cost structure. But the next 3 to 5 years will be quite an uphill battle.
Thomas, fascinating to hear your views on nuclear, and I hopefully will come back to that in a moment. But Paul, let me bring you into the conversation. The IPCC published a red alert, essentially speaking to the urgency to take immediate action to combat climate change and reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. Has that warning actually changed anything in the corporate world? You obviously, as an engineering company, have major exposure to customers and visibility into what other corporates have been doing.
I think alarms like the one that you note accelerate an already irreversible trend. The world is locking arms on a march to a zero carbon world. Most companies, certainly most well-run engineering companies, have publicly committed to their net zero ambitions. In the case of Smiths, we'll be net zero from operations by 2040, net zero from scopes 1, 2, and 3 by 2050. So the world is already marching in that direction, and the more we can do together to accelerate that pace, of course, is helpful.
Paul, I can tell from your accent, I think you're American, so I'm going to put a question to you about the type of political backlash that companies are facing now and heading into the midterms. Obviously, one of the topics, there are many topics that have come up, but one of the topics is this so-called rise against wokeism, rise against companies that are pushing for too fast of a transition away from fossil fuels. Many senior politicians in the Republican Party have been quite vocal about that. How do you, as a CEO of a company, deal with some of the political backlash that's coming your way from politicians who are actually against the drive to move away from fossil fuels and towards a cleaner, greener future in the time frame that companies and businesses are setting for it?
Yeah, the centerpiece of this is what people call energy transition. It's the multi-decade march, beginning with low carbon fuel sources and eventually migrating to no carbon fuel sources. And people who live and work in this mega trend every day, like Smith does, typically the walk around number is $100 trillion investment by the world. And the good news about it is that this is very much driven by market forces and pull from stakeholders. This is not a push, compliance, or fear-led need. I think you don't have to make a trade-off here. I think for folks who participate in this world, there's both the near-term need to make the existing energy infrastructure more efficient and more clean. And then there is a parallel need for the world to build an all-new, low, no-carbon infrastructure. So I don't see a trade-off here. I think it's a net benefit, certainly one where our stakeholders are all aligned.
Thomas, let me bring you back into the conversation, follow up on your comments about nuclear in Germany. It's clearly a very controversial source of energy within the country. It sounds as though you are a proponent of nuclear. Where does that support come from? How would it change the German energy picture if we did see more solid support? And does it realistically have a future in the country?
Yeah, we as Bilfinger actually work worldwide. And we are actually quite active in the nuclear industry, especially in Germany in the demobilization, but in other countries to build new plants. So we have quite an open mind in it. Then you look into the energy supply and, of course, the CO2 and sustainability footprint of the different energy sources what we have. We all believe that in a few years, 5 to 10 years, we can establish new technologies, new industries with a hell of a good business potential with green energy. But at the same time, we have an existing infrastructure, very much in Germany coal-based, that fossil fuel-based, and that is what we have still to go on because we have not enough energy. And on a third level, we have nuclear power, which is in a lot of countries, in Japan too, by the way, they start to build new plants too, as a green technology. And if you look into the footprint of a nuclear power plant, you can support that. So that's actually a pure technical comment what I made, that I'm, as an engineer, supporting the nuclear energy.
helpful insight. Really fascinating to hear as an engineer. Well, to another engineering expert, let's get back over to Paul. As an engineering company, one of your roles, I suppose, in the green transition is to help come up with new solutions and ways to make engineering processes more green. How do you engineer change into processes to reduce energy consumption and cut CO2 emissions?
Yeah, I'll give you three pretty good examples across different parts of our business. The first is the energy transition that you already mentioned. With our energy customers, there's no question that sustainability is a top 3 priority for every one of them. So again, we're working in alignment with that. And things fail at points of connection. You know, doors fall off at hinges, athletic careers end with knee injuries. For energy companies, leaks happen at points of connection, and we're working with them on the seals that go into their systems to address that. Another example, which is probably best known to your listeners today, is in aviation security. Everyone who's been to one of the major airports in the world, whether it's Heathrow or Kennedy or Schiphol, you know, have put their bag on the detection machine. That is a major use of power in the airports. So we're working with airports, and Willie talked about this more broadly earlier. You know, the solutions we use not only reduce energy consumption by 10 to 90%, it increases throughput through the airport. Anyone who hasn't had to take their laptop or fluids out of their bag, you know, are familiar with CT technology. The third example was just announced last month, a very exciting example in the steel industry, one of the hardest to abate contributors to greenhouse gases. About 8% of global emissions come from the making of steel. And of course, our world can't get by without making steel. We announced a partnership with H2 Green Steel and with Midrex for the first zero emission steel manufacturing process. We happen to make the electric elements that superheat the hydrogen. So there's multiple examples of how technology combined with collaboration is moving this thing forward.
Thomas, I just want to round up the discussion with you, and I just wonder to what extent the conversations you're having with shareholders is driving your desire to move towards a net zero target, to sort of become less reliant on fossil fuels and on high carbon emitters. How has that dialogue evolved, especially in light of the action that has taken place over the last 12, 18 months between the pandemic and obviously the Russia-Ukraine war?
Yeah, as you know, I'm the new CEO since March of this year. And we came out to the market to say that we want to be the #1 in industrial service, as an industrial service provider, with the clear focus on efficiency and sustainability improvement. So sustainability is in the core of our vision, in the core of our strategy, and actually in the core of all our doing. We can help customers a lot to improve their footprint. On the other side, our investors, analysts, the capital market, media too, you too, are very much interested. What can we do more to get faster into a better future? And as Paul said, we always have to look into existing industries, existing setups, and new technologies. There's a lot of talk about new technologies on the investor side too. But the big part of the work today is actually for us on existing plants to help customers with any investment to get more sustainable. We see now out of the energy crisis here in Europe especially, that investors more and more look into that, what we call the brownfield approach too, to help customers to get more sustainable.
Very clear. All right, we are going to leave this panel here. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us. Thomas Schultz, the CEO of Bilfinger, and Paul Keel, the CEO of Smiths Group. Now, our colleague in Singapore, Sri Jagaraja, spoke with the MD and CEO of Mahindra Group and CNBC ESG Council member Dr. Anish Shah, and asked if the Indian corporate giant is on track to hit its own sustainability targets.
We bought an electric vehicle company at that point, began a number of projects internally We were the first to set up a carbon-free plant or carbon-neutral plant in India, which is also zero waste to landfill in Igatpuri. We were among the first to set up science-based targets for 21 of our companies, also among the first to set up carbon pricing, and we were water positive in 2014. So our journey actually has begun a long time back. There have been a number of actions taken more recently to accelerate that, and we are now targeting to be planet positive by 2040. We've brought our targets up by 10 years. We were first looking at carbon neutral by 2050, and we've also expanded our targets to continue to be water positive across the group, to be zero waste to landfill. We've set targets for EP100 and RE100 to reach them by 2025 and 26, because what we realize is setting targets for the long term is nice, but it really doesn't get us anywhere. So we're looking at short-term targets. What can we achieve now? And our activities are really classified into three categories: greening ourselves, decarbonizing industries, and nurturing the planet.
Turning to diversity, equity and inclusion, how is Mahindra prioritizing education for girls and encouraging the participation of women in farming?
So we have a program called Nani Kali, which means a little flower. And this is focused on educating the girl child. It's a program that's run for 25 years now. And we help educate 150,000 girls every year. So it's one that has made a very tangible impact. In fact, there have been a number of other corporates who've joined us in this effort as well. And our goal here again is ambitious, is to start taking it to 1 million a year over the next few years. The second aspect around farming, we have a program called Prerna, which is really focused on women in farming. And there are a number of actions around skilling, around creating employment, and helping women get on their feet. And that is now translating to a bigger program for us, where we've set another target of getting to 1 million women empowered every year, where we want them to be on their feet in terms of being able to get compensation or be skilled to be able to do jobs either for themselves on their farms or working with others.
COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Is this going to be a call to arms for climate negotiators, Anish, do you believe? And how challenging will it be to get the transition back on track? And how confident are you that the $100 billion annually that is needed to help finance the transition to net zero for developing countries, that will be committed?
In all the discussions we've had with multiple stakeholders, everyone is committed to this. Everyone realizes the importance. There have been some short-term setbacks, exactly as you outlined, but from what we understand, that does not take away from the overall goals. So I would be very optimistic that, yes, we can get this back on track. And I do believe the industry is playing a very significant role in this as well. So it's not just the governments, it has to be a partnership with industry that helps take this forward.
And a very final question, Anish. How committed would you say is the Modi government to decarbonisation efforts of the major industries in India, and could they be doing more?
I've had numerous discussions with various ministers in this government, and I can tell you categorically that the level of commitment is extremely high. This starts with all the commitments that Prime Minister Modi made at COP26. Getting to 50% renewable energy by 2030 is a huge target. And that also comes with reducing the price for renewable energy. It is already fairly low in India at 2.7 kilowatts per hour. The target is to get to 1.3. And today, therefore, renewable is an integral part of the electric chain, not something that is being subsidized. Beyond that, even as we've talked about various initiatives around the First Movers Coalition, in a discussion with one of the ministers, his question was, why do we have only 2 Indian companies on the 35 companies that we have as part of the First Movers Coalition? How can we get a lot more Indian companies part of this? How can India really play a leadership role across everything that's happening? So these are 2 examples, but across many more conversations, the government is very committed and is really playing a role to help get both government policies at the same time encourage industries to play a bigger role in this.
Well, the fashion and transport industries have also made a big push to improve their green credentials. Tanya joins us with more. Tanya.
Thank you so much, Jemana. Talking transport, I recently caught up with 2016 Formula One world champion, sustainability entrepreneur and CNBC ESG council member Nico Rosberg in London ahead of his Green Tech Festival. I talked to him about what's needed now to accelerate the transition to green mobility and began by asking him what he hopes leaders at COP27 will achieve.
I had the honor of being at COP26 in Glasgow. I was there for representing Sports for Climate Action because I have an electric racing team and also supporting some of our partners like Sky Group. And from COP27, I hope that maybe we could make progress in global agreements. Because in COP26, yes, there was, okay, we need to go carbon neutral quicker, of course, the energy transition, but it still lacked that unity, you know, the global coming together. And that's so crucial that everybody agrees, because otherwise it's always going to be like, yeah, but why should we if they're not? And I hope so much that we can have a better coming together in COP27, even though I know it's always a big challenge.
Nico, from your experience at COP26, what was the atmosphere like? And do you feel that these meetings are relevant?
Of course, there was a lot of criticism, but I still think it's very relevant and very powerful for so many decision makers to come together and on such an important topic. There's always going to be a positive outcome from that. And so I really believe in these meetings, and I think it's great that the United Nations is putting that together.
And Nico, in your eyes, what more needs to be done in terms of a sustainable future from green mobility?
Green mobility, the transition needs to go faster. That's one thing, of course. I mean, the penetration of these of the electric mobility, and yes, in the Western world, you know, it's going to come sooner. But the big problem also is then developing countries. It's going to take so much longer, and we really need to find solutions and price points there to accelerate that transition there as well. Because only on a global scale is it really going to make a difference. And those are the challenges we're still facing.
And of course, from your extreme racing, you're seeing it from different countries, what's going on. What stood out for you?
Well, that's why we do this electric off-road world championship. We race in very extreme locations because one benefit of that is we showcase also how cool electromobility is, and how useful and how much sense it makes with this racing. And hopefully there we can also help to support, shift that consumer mindset, you know, even in developing countries where, of course, affordability is an issue, but maybe by shifting their mindset and getting interest, it does accelerate that nevertheless, you know, so that's what we've been seeing globally.
Do you feel the younger generation are more engaged with climate action?
Of course, the younger generation is massively engaged. I can see it from my two young daughters, a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old. They're learning it in school and they're being interested. And I'm doing a big reforestation initiative in Sardinia in December. And I'm starting to speak to my eldest daughter and saying, hey, you know, we're going to be meeting some of the families that were devastated by this forest fire. And we're going to be on their land, planting trees, you know, helping them rejuvenate their lands. Do you want to join? And she was like, yeah, you know, Daddy, I would love to see that and be involved and help you plant those trees. And so it's really nice to be able to take them along.
Well, to the fashion industry now, I'm joined by Livia Firth, co-founder and creative director of EcoAge and CNBC ESG council member. Hello, Livia. Thank you so much for joining me live from Umbria in Italy. How are you?
I'm well, Tanya. It's lovely to see you and speaking to you again.
Well, Livia, of course, you've been an outspoken voice for achieving sustainability across the fashion industry for many years now. Is fast fashion still the biggest enemy?
Well, I think we can all agree that we wouldn't be here talking about sustainability or sustainable fashion if fast fashion didn't exist. Because if you think about it, it's a business model predicated on producing huge volumes of clothes incredibly cheaply to be discarded very quickly on repeat. And today we even have ultra fast fashion brands like Shein that have emerged, which make the fast fashion brands like H&M or Zara look like sustainable option. I think that we all have to agree that also that sustainability is almost the wrong word that we're using today, and the wrong goal for businesses, because to sustain suggests that we benchmark exactly where we are and we keep things at that level, and we can't do it anymore because, you know, we only have one planet and we're using 3 planets worth of resources already.
What do you think are the most substantial changes today that fashion producers and brands can do to truly become more sustainable, and also for the consumer? Really shifted enough, do you think, Livia?
I think public awareness has shifted a lot. Where is that enough? I don't believe so. Because again, if you look at like ultra fast fashion phenomenon of Shein, you actually wonder whether anyone has been, you know, hearing anything in the last few years. In terms of solutions, both from businesses and consumers, but also governments, I think that the only possible solution today is slowing down. We need to have a very serious conversation about degrowth and about just transition. Like, how do we get there? And in terms of degrowth, it's a word that always, you know, causes a lot of like negative thought immediately. But in the summer, for example, I read an article by an advisor on climate and energy called Sandy Kunas, and she was in fact saying that degrowth is a word that for some people is like Vivaldi's Fourth Season, and for others is like the nails against the chalkboard. But she explains it in one of the clearest way that I ever heard, which is, you know, finite resources cannot sustain infinite growth. We know that. And that's the critique that degrowth expresses. But in contrast to economic recession, degrowth is not negative growth. You know, it's a deliberate set of measures that aims at reducing the non-essential production and consumption in order to reduce the total energy and material footprint of the modern economy. So you have production and you have consumption, and both have to think about how do we scale it down.
And how do we combat corporate greenwashing?
Well, it's interesting because, you know, again, looking at fashion, we have a huge problem because the brands are trying to protect their business, but in fact, there are businesses that need to protect people that make the fashion. So you have the issues like living wages, you have migration as a result of poverty and all of that. You have floods in Pakistan, which is one of the biggest producer of, you know, manufacturing fashion, and you need to protect the materials. And in terms of materials, you know, we had the big discussion today of natural fibers versus synthetic fibers. And yesterday, the Changing Market Foundation released yet another incredible investigation linking directly Russian oil to one of the biggest polyester manufacturer in India that then supplies some of the biggest brands that we are all wearing. So we know that fashion relies on fossil fuels. And instead of brands putting efforts today into genuine transformation and remediation, they invest all their money into greenwashing operation, like green capsule collection or ambassadorial role to the Kardashian as a sustainability ambassador, like Boohoo recently did. But when will they stop prioritizing the agility of greenwashing strategies over the efficacy of meaningful and responsible impact reduction strategy? I bet you it costs exactly the same amount of money.
Do you think there's been any progress made, though, Livia? I last spoke to you at the Sustainable Future Forum in 2021. Has there been any significant change?
There's been some change that is happening now at legislative level, and I think this is an industry that urgently needs to be regulated. And so both at EU level now in Brussels and in the US, there have been a lot of legislation that are coming up that are being proposed, like in the US, the Fabric Act, for example. And consumers also and competition authorities in Europe are particularly coming down on greenwashing. And if you look at the recent example of Norway, for example, ruling unlawful the use of the Higg methodology index, which is a widely used methodology to measure sustainability in fashion by a lot of companies, is a huge step forward.
Livia, you created the Renaissance Awards to honour the work of young global leaders in sustainability. Why is that so important for you? What have you learned from them? And also, I just want to ask you, of course, we're coming up to COP27. So what is your message for global leaders there?
Well, in terms of the Renaissance Awards, we need to pass the microphone today to the young leaders, because they are the ones who are not only inheriting the future, but they're building the future today. And they're working on incredible solutions. They already know what to do. And unless we ask them, and pass the mic to them, we're never going to include their change in our solution. This year, we awarded young leaders like Sofia Kiani, which is a young American Iranian activist who founded Climate Cardinals, which is an international non-for-profit with over 5,000 volunteers all over the world that translate climate information into more than 100 languages. Or Nina Coalingua, an indigenous woman, leader of the Quechua community in Ecuador, who campaigns for climate justice and indigenous rights. Or Lino Marrero, who is 15, invented a shoe that can charge a cell phone. So this is fundamental that these young leaders, we should have a COP only for them, and they should be the one at COP27 in the legislation room, in the decision-making room. And in terms for the message to COP, we absolutely need to use fashion and consider fashion as one of the biggest industry, biggest polluter, biggest employer of slave labor worldwide. I refer to the changing market investigation recently. Like, we know that we are never gonna achieve the targets that we have put in place when 60% of the fashion industry relies on oil-based fibers, and no one is talking about.
Well, Livia, thank you so much for joining me again on Sustainable Future Forum. Livia Firth, co-founder and creative director of EcoAge. Jemana, back to you.
And thank you to you, Tanya. Well, that is it for the 2022 CNBC Sustainable Future Forum. Join us on CNBC TV next week for full coverage of COP27 that will be live from Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, if you didn't catch all of this program live, or you want to rewatch any of today's interviews and panels, head to cnbc.com. Thank you again for watching. Hope you enjoyed.